Alright y'all, let's talk all about liquidation. Hey y'all, welcome back to my YouTube channel. For those of y'all who are new here, my name is MOGIBETH and I own a 6-figure reselling business selling women's clothes on places like Poshmark and eBay. Today we're talking about one of the reasons why I was able to scale so quickly over the past year, and that is liquidation. If you're subscribed to my newsletter, our very first one back in May showed a photo of a pretty horrendous pallet that we received, and this was really the first time I had ever publicly disclosed that we source via liquidation, and that was purposeful. We've been experimenting with buying liquidation since February of 2020, about a month before COVID really shut things down. And while we could have discussed it publicly at the time and probably received a lot of views, sponsorships, affiliate dollars, etc., we felt really strongly that it would be an irresponsible thing to do since we didn't really have a full grasp on the risk involved with liquidation. And really the last thing that I wanted to do was be an influencer who was recommending you to risk hundreds or even thousands of dollars on something that I didn't understand fully myself. And then B, I knew I wouldn't be able to disclose the number one question that comes along with liquidation, which is where do you get your pallets or where do you source liquidation? And I still won't be able to disclose that today, which I know is disappointing, but I'll tell you this, and it echoes something my friend Denali posted on Instagram, which I'll put up here and link below, but people who really invest in liquidation over the long term and actually build their businesses around it won't tell you their sources. And what I can tell you is that I don't get pallets from Quick Lots, B&G, Jomar, any of the other ones that you've probably heard on social media, and we'll talk about why later in this video. But I think after watching this video, you'll have a better understanding of how to research and what to look for when seeking out liquidation sources. Okay, so what we will discuss today are the following topics. First, what is liquidation? Then the cons of liquidation, next the pros of liquidation, and finally my thoughts on the current landscape of liquidation. In this video, we're going to focus primarily on clothing liquidation since I am a clothing reseller, and I purposefully want to cover cons before pros because losses hurt a lot. Probably more than you think. And I'm actually going to put up this handy chart that shows the relationship between taking a loss and the necessary gain needed on the leftover capital to make it back. If you remember back to elementary school math word problems, discounting something by 10% and then re-adding that 10% does not get you to the same number. The same goes with losses and gains. 10% loss would require an 11% gain to make it back to your original starting point, and a 20% loss would require a 25% gain just to get back to that original starting point. And if you see that pattern, you'll understand that the gap only widens the bigger your original loss is. For example, a 50% loss on an investment would leave you with only 50% of your original capital. So you need to double, aka have a 100% gain just to get back to where you started. So while I'm not trying to dissuade you from exploring liquidation, the point of this video is that if you do choose to proceed toward this sourcing option, I only want you to do so with your eyes open. Okay, so let's quickly discuss what is liquidation. For clothing resale purposes, wholesale liquidation is one way that large retailers such as Amazon, Nordstrom's, Macy's, etc. need to get rid of their excess inventory. And this inventory can be customer returns, overstock, closeout, aka they're closing a store or they're liquidating their business entirely, or salvage, meaning inventory with significant damages that needs to be repaired or refurbished. Oftentimes retailers will actually sell their excess inventory to off-price retailers such as TJ Maxx, Steinmart, Blue Fly, etc. And so a lot of resellers, including myself, will actually go to these off-price retailers and do a little retail arbitrage, and I actually have a video on that very topic from a while ago that's still, I think, really valuable, which I'll link up on the screen in case you want to explore retail arbitrage. But other times, these retailers will get rid of their excess inventory, especially slightly damaged inventory, and try to recoup some of their losses by selling their goods in large pallets or truckloads. And generally, they'll sell them as either manifested or unmanifested. Manifested inventory will tell you on a spreadsheet exactly what you will be receiving, and then unmanifested inventory won't. Instead, it will tell you the number of items, or sometimes it will just tell you the weight of what you are receiving. Manifested pallets obviously are typically more expensive than unmanifested. Affordable, manifested, high quality pallets are generally very difficult to come by. And so when these large retailers look to sell off their merchandise, they'll typically work work with one of two different types of companies, a liquidation broker or a liquidation wholesaler. A liquidation broker typically never takes possession of the inventory. Instead, they find buyers either through established relationships or auctions and then broker that transaction. And then at that point, the retailer will actually ship the inventory straight to the customer. And a liquidation wholesaler will purchase the inventory outright from the retailer, and then they'll find a buyer and sell it. And so with this setup, resellers are typically the third part of this whole liquidation chain. However, buying from a liquidation broker is usually a lot cheaper than buying from a liquidation wholesaler. Why is that? Because storage costs and shipping these pallets is incredibly expensive. So liquidation wholesalers have to include those additional costs into their sales price. And moreover, some liquidation wholesalers choose to actually break up their inventory into smaller boxes, which require labor costs, material costs, etc. So they have to factor that into their sales price as well. Also, sometimes these liquidation wholesalers will actually buy from a liquidation broker, take possession of it, and then sell it to a buyer, making the reseller the fourth stop in the chain. And do you see where I'm going with this? As a reseller, it's really important to be aware of the liquidation company's business model and to think of it from that perspective, because each additional intermediary between you and the retailer will cut into your profit margin. And if you're caught up as the fourth stop in the liquidation chain, not only are your profit margins slimmer, but so are the profit margins of the business that you purchased from, which means that they can't necessarily afford to curate their inventory really well or even accept returns. And let me tell you, there are so many wholesale liquidation companies of all different sizes, business models, degrees of credibility. There are probably some in your local area, and there are tons listed online. This is a massive multi-billion-dollar industry, but it's not always easy to navigate. So the question I get most often is, how do I find a reputable liquidation company? Okay, number one, before you work with any liquidation company, it's really important to do your due diligence. Call and talk to a customer representative, prepare questions that you want to ask them, gauge their level of professionalism, and then I would maybe recommend going to the Better Business Bureau. If the company exists on there, that at least tells you that the company's been around for a while. I don't know how much weight I'd put on the complaints unless they're occurring over and over and over again, but the thing I would pay attention to is how the company responds to those complaints, because that will help show you how they'll deal with you if you ever have issues or complaints in the future. But second of all, and I'm definitely not calling anyone out here, believe me, but I personally wouldn't recommend blindly following a recommendation from an influencer. Even if that influencer isn't paid by the liquidation company, these liquidation companies, at least the ones that have been circulating around the reselling community, have basic PR skills. They know to send their good inventory to people who are going to showcase it on places like YouTube or Instagram. So I wouldn't necessarily expect the inventory that you receive to be the same level of quality that you might see on those places. And then the third thing is, it may be a good idea if you're brand new to liquidation to actually start out with small boxes instead of a full-blown pallet. You'll more likely pay more per item, but worst comes to worst, you'll only be out a few $100s rather than a few $1,000s. And as I mentioned earlier, some of these liquidation wholesalers that you've probably heard of sell these smaller boxes, and I don't think it's a bad idea to just get started there just to get a feel for it. But lastly, how I recommend finding profitable liquidation opportunities is by doing research. We'll talk about the landscape of the liquidation industry at the end of the video, but more and more resellers are really interested in and flocking to liquidation. So if you want above average liquidation opportunities, you're going to have to put in above average legwork. That means Googling, researching, getting on the phone, reaching to personal or professional contacts, and so on. And this is something that I'm always doing, and I put a lot of time and effort into finding our sources. Once you find them, you'll realize why people don't necessarily share them. They're not always the easiest to find, and there's always a limited amount available. I mean, these are essentially trade secrets, so don't expect an influencer or a YouTube video to hand it to you on a silver platter. The really good stuff is usually the hardest to find. One more thing I wanted to mention before jumping into the cons of liquidation is that you'll almost always need a reseller license, permit, or exemption certificate so that you don't have to pay sales tax. Getting that really comes down to what state you're in. Some states make it easy, some make it a little more difficult. And then there are states like Oregon where we don't have sales tax that don't require them at all. So I haven't purchased from Quick Lots or B&G or any of those, so I don't know if they require require you to provide that, but legally, if they're not charging you sales tax, they should be requiring that. But if they are charging you sales tax, then provide them with your permit and they should remove that. Okay, so let's discuss the cons of liquidation. The first con I want to talk about is the concept of high risk, high reward. And you'll hear this phrase in the reselling community or entrepreneurial communities a lot. And what's often left out is the other side of the coin, which is equally true, and that is high risk, high losses. But really the way that we use that phrase, high risk, high reward, even though we know deep down that one of the defining characteristics of risk is taking on the chance that you'll lose it all, we still talk about it as if it's basically guaranteed to work out. So that begs the question, how much are you actually willing to or able to lose? So I want to paint a hypothetical picture of a reseller situation. Let's say that you started out reselling by going to the Goodwill outlet and flipping items that you purchased for $1 and having an average sales price of $25. And after months and months of hard work, you've saved $3,000 in profit. I say $3,000 because that's typically the minimum for a clothing Gaylord pallet these days, which if you don't know what a Gaylord pallet is, it looks like one of these, which you may have seen on Instagram. But say you have $3,000 and you want to increase your ASP and you just don't have access to higher end brands in your area. So you hear an influencer talk about liquidation and decide to take the leap. I'm telling you from my own experience, there is a possibility that you could lose a lot of that investment. Or really a more likely scenario is that you end up spending a lot of time, energy, and effort just to recoup that $1,000 and be back to where you started. Or a more likely scenario is that you end up spending a lot of time, energy, and effort just to recoup that $3,000 and get back to where you started. And so I think it's really important to ask yourself, once again, would your reselling business be able to survive a hit like that? Could the momentum and motivation that you've built up over time survive a hit like that? I will tell you from experience, even if you feel confident that you could survive a hit like that because you're resilient, it takes a really big mental and emotional tool. Unfortunately, when it comes to liquidation, especially the unmanifested kind with an unreliable source, it can sometimes be like gambling. And the thing they say about gambling is true. Don't risk money that you aren't seriously okay with losing. Which leads me to another con. Liquidation throws away your alpha. So let me explain what I mean by alpha. Finance, alpha refers to the excess returns earned on an investment above the benchmark return. Another simpler way of saying this is that you beat the market. Okay, so how does this apply to reselling? In reselling, one way to beat the market or have an alpha is by accumulating knowledge and experience of what sells and what doesn't, and then hand selecting those items that will perform especially well. You can think of it this way: whenever you're at the thrift store buying something, you're essentially placing a bet. And the more research and knowledge and experience you accumulate, the higher the probability that your bet will result in a high return. So the research, knowledge, and experience is essentially your alpha. However, with liquidation, especially unmanifested liquidation, you aren't hand selecting inventory. You get whatever you get, and that's over a variety of different brands, many of which have little to no resale value. And so that knowledge and experience that you've accumulated, aka your alpha, is virtually useless. This is one of the reasons why I still thrift and don't rely exclusively on liquidation. On average, my hand selected items outperform my liquidated ones in terms of profit margin and sell-through rate. And I think this is something that is really important to have as a reseller. Developing an alpha by niching down and researching and accumulating that knowledge is what gives resellers an edge in the marketplace compared to any old person just selling clothes from their closet, which is why it's a major component of our reselling course if you've taken that, and if not, there's a link below. So with liquidation, you can't leverage your alpha, and what you get is essentially up to luck, which leads me to my next point, the cash flow issues with liquidation. Okay, so another thing about liquidation, when you purchase, you usually have to pay up front and you have to pay in cash. And I've paid anywhere from $4 per item to $40 per item. But again, from our experience, you'll typically spend on average $3,000 including shipping on a full pallet of clothing. So okay, remember that photo from the newsletter that I mentioned earlier? I'll pop it up here. I ordered that pallet on March 23rd. I received it on May 6th, and it arrived with the sides of the Gaylord completely missing. Most of the items were damaged, and many were damaged beyond repair. So as soon as it arrived, we filed a dispute with the carrier, but we're filming this on June 14th, and we still have no refund and no resolution. So now, frankly, in our experience, that's a less likely scenario, but the pallet we ordered right after that one was probably the worst pallet I've ordered just from a resale value standpoint. So that's roughly $6,000 of our cash that's tied up in inventory that was either destroyed or difficult to sell. And so if you recall from our $200,000 video, which I'll link up on the screen, one of the things that we mentioned was being mindful of cash flow. And as a reseller, whether it's a death pile or a destroyed pallet, you never want to be in a situation where money is tied up in unlisted or unsellable assets. And another consideration that you may have paid attention to earlier is that oftentimes these liquidation pallets take a while to arrive. It depends on where you're located, where the pallet you're ordering from is located, the liquidation company, and the carrier. But I would say plan on having your money tied up for at least 2 weeks up to 2 months, which again is not ideal from a cash flow standpoint. Luckily, in our business, we'll be fine. We have some cash reserves to weather the storm. But again, this leads me to this question: could your business survive that kind of situation? All right, the last con I want to touch on before heading on to pros is not really a business related one, but it's just that liquidation isn't as fun as thrifting. And the first few pallets you receive are actually really exciting because you don't know what you're gonna get. But if you keep ordering from the same retailers, you're gonna see a lot of the same brands and even the same styles over and over again. Every single pallet that I've ever received, I get at least some inventory that's either damaged beyond repair or just doesn't have any resale value. So it becomes more of kind of an inventory management systems and figuring out what to do with these different items than it does become about inventory selection. And I think for many of us, inventory selection, aka thrifting, is the best part. And liquidation essentially removes that best part. So if you're looking at liquidation resellers and thinking that the grass is greener over there, in some ways it is, and we'll talk about that in a second, but in a lot of ways it actually is a lot more just duller and less fun and a little bit more boring. Okay, so now let's talk about the pros of liquidation. If liquidation was all bad, we wouldn't still be doing it, but we still do. However, the pros of liquidation are pretty straightforward. First of all, in our experience, on average, liquidation is profitable. It's a viable sourcing strategy as long as you're sourcing from the right companies and you're getting the right type of inventory. And then the second thing is that oftentimes you can receive brands in liquidation that you wouldn't otherwise be able to find within Goodwill or your local thrift stores. And then third, it allows you to scale much faster. Being able to source that much volume within one transaction allows you to list much more inventory much faster, growing the size of your business and growing your sales. And then the last pro is the opportunity cost of sourcing at scale. Since it eliminates a lot of the time and labor that you would spend searching for and hand selecting inventory, it opens that time or opportunity to pursue more profitable endeavors like listing or more creative endeavors like starting a YouTube channel. So those are the pros, but the last thing I want to touch on before wrapping up the video is just talk a little bit about the current landscape of liquidation. And as I mentioned previously, we started our experience with liquidation back in February 2020. But since then, it has gotten a lot more competitive, more expensive, and oftentimes the inventory just isn't quite as good. So during the pandemic, due to the decreased demand of non-essential goods and the closure of a lot of brick and mortar stores, retailers were offloading a lot of their inventory, so the supply of liquidation inventory went up. But then over the course of that year, since thrift stores were closed, more and more resellers flocked to liquidation. So the supply and the demand of liquidation kind of leveled off a bit. But now the demand for non-essential goods has rebounded, brick and mortar stores are opening, and a lot of retailers are facing issues with supply chains, causing inventory levels to be low. So retailers have less of a need for inventory liquidation. And that means the supply of liquidated inventory has cut back drastically, but the demand from resellers has stayed the same, if not increased. And this is why liquidation pallets are becoming more and more expensive, making the margins thinner and thinner. And if the industry continues along this trajectory, I could easily imagine a reality where liquidation opportunities aren't really worth the risk anymore. But of course, like any industry, these circumstances are subject to change change with things like seasonality, economic conditions, less congestion within the global supply chain, etc. So that's something that we're definitely keeping an eye on, and we'll see what happens. But if you want to get into liquidation, I think it may be worth following retail trends a little bit more closely. And two ways that I do this is by subscribing to Retail Brew, which I've mentioned on this YouTube channel before, but it's basically a weekly newsletter that's an offshoot from Morning Brew, which is a daily newsletter that covers business news, but Retail Brew focuses around the retail industry. I like them both and I subscribe to them both, and so I'll link them down below in case you're interested. I don't get any kind of money from that, but I just think it's a really good resource. But the other way I find to keep on top of trends and the industry is by setting Google alerts for different keywords or different retailers, and you can also do that for Poshmark, eBay, reselling, or any other topics that you want to stay informed about. But anyways, that's the video. Thank y'all so much for watching. I hope you don't feel frightened, but instead feel informed. And if you do choose to pursue liquidation, my final words is just to be careful about who you buy it from. Try to do as much due diligence as possible. Be realistic about what you can and can't afford. And no matter what, I think it's a really good idea to diversify your sourcing strategy. I continue to thrift, to go to buy sell trade stores, and do retail arbitrage because the more reliant you are on any one sourcing outlet or strategy, the more susceptible you are to risk. So anyways, I hope y'all found this video helpful. Let me know in the comments down below if you have any comments or questions. I'll be really interested to hear your thoughts and experiences with liquidation. If you haven't already, give this video a big old thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see y'all in my next one. All right, love y'all.